So then you look at the multiple entity piece. The first thing that's important here is understanding how power will be shared and balanced. Because whenever you have a group of players around the table with each person playing a role, there is the risk of creating a true leadership vacuum where nobody feels like it's really owned and that they all are just kind of figuring out what their piece is. So addressing the power issue is critical when you have multiple entities, especially because these are not necessarily multiple entities who have been working together up until this point. So you haven't had the opportunity to do the relationship building. I would suggest that whatever process you use, you have some opportunity for relationship building, but we'll talk about that when we get to the actual selection process. If you have multiple entities, they're likely going to need more commitment of support and direction from the Ferguson Commission up until the sunset date. So you'll probably be active with this group more so than with a single entity. Because they have a decentralized formation, you may have to establish some level of a leadership group. It could be something that you appoint as an ad hoc group that meets occasionally. It could be that this group decides to check in with them once a year, or members of this group, but you will have to establish some type of accountability body when you have multiple entities working together. But it does require significant relationship building, more so than the single entity. So I'm going to dive into some of the characteristics for the single entity. They generally need to have a broad mission and sophisticated infrastructure with existing networks. Now, this doesn't mean that they have to be able to do everything in your plan, but they should have the ability to do most of it. And the way that you would be able to determine that is if you were able to look at your signature priorities and identify one common theme that crosses all priorities. Let's say economic development. Let's say somebody can make the case that if you can address economic development, it touches most of your work. Then that would make it simpler for you to identify a single entity who's already working in that space, who already has capacity around economic development, who could drive most of your agenda. And for those pieces that don't naturally fit within their scope, they would have the ability to identify new and essential partners to make sure that all of the work gets done. Going with the single entity is probably the simplest, most straightforward way to proceed, but it would require you to identify that one issue that you feel could become a big enough umbrella to get most of the work done. And I have some examples of some large institutions that could possibly play a single entity role, depending on what priority you would select as being overarching enough. So you could go with someone like the St. Louis Economic Development Council. If you went with the economic development lens, an organization like East-West Gateway, who already does regional planning, the Regional Business Council, but it would have to be something that's big enough that they have the infrastructure to do all of the supportive tasks that need to happen. And I'm just going to read these 5 bullets because I have to remember folks in the back. So they have to have a clear self-interest, authority to convene and align, ability to further shape and refine the plan, public accountability, and planning expertise. Because even though you've already created a plan, there is going to have to be further refinement of steps and how to carry out the plan. And I'm going to give you an example of a single entity collective impact initiative. So when I talked about the research that was done to identify the 5 key elements for what makes collective impact work, one of the models that was studied was the STRIVE initiative. And the STRIVE initiative focuses on college completion and really on improving public education or improving education in general. In the Seattle area, their STRIVE initiative is called the Roadmap Project. And this slide depicts the process that they went through in their planning process. They started off with alignment of all of the sectors that are involved in education, and then they added parent and community engagement, and then they started to look at data, and they used all of that to create stronger systems for delivering public education. These are the steps that they took to reach their goals. The goals that they identified for themselves were healthy and ready for kindergarten, supported and successful in school, graduate from high school, college, and career ready, earn a college degree or credential. So again, with a single entity, they normally have one overarching focus, but they are still convening all of the same sectors that you would typically convene, just focused on one issue. So now we're going to talk about the idea of having multiple entities. If you go with the multiple entity structure, the middle circle is more of an intermediary. They need to be proficient in managing relationships. So again, it's not just a contract or a vendor. And then you're able to hone in on highly specialized partners. So you're able to say, in this space of community engagement, who do we really need that's already an expert in this space to come into this structure to make sure that that's done well? Who do we have that's already in the capacity building space, or the convening and aligning, or the issue specific? So if you have a specific action that you really want to make sure that the folks who are working on, equity have their own leadership piece, that's how the multiple entity would work. They would take direction from a coordinating body. So again, you'd have to have some structure to offer direction to this group. It's not the intermediary. So it's not the person that's managing the relationships. It could be that each entity has a representative that forms this leadership or coordinating body, but keep in mind that there needs to be an accountable structure there. The intermediary or the relationship manager would have to be neutral and respected. Again, all of these organizations would have to have very high public accountability. They would have to have the ability to allocate resources, their own resources, as well as fundraise and planning expertise. So some of the same skill sets, just spread out across multiple entities. If at all possible, they should be politically neutral, not a direct service provider, and not dependent on fundraising, if possible. I know that narrows the field, but some options for that intermediary could be the Greater St. Louis Community Foundation, Youth Bridge Community Foundation, Community Builders Network, folks that are in a position to convene that are neutral, that are not necessarily reliant on fundraising. So any questions?
Yeah, the politically neutral piece trips me up, particularly when the work, and even as I look at some of the examples, we spent some time kind of dealing with this stuff together, the advancement of a policy agenda requires some orientation around political activity that may not be in the same way with something like Strive. So if you could say a little bit about how one can be politically neutral when the core of the work is advancing politics.
Right, so the core of the work is not necessarily advancing politics, advancing policies. Advancing policies is a strategy to get to a particular set of outcomes. So the way that I'm looking at it is you have your neutral convener, and you have partners. Some of them are close partners, some of them are arm's length partners, and you coordinate with your partners to do those actions that wouldn't be a natural fit for your neutral convener. I think the thing that people have to be comfortable with is allowing people to excel in the space that is best suited for them, and not to expect one entity to be able to do all of it. Because if that could happen, it would have happened by now. We would have this one super entity. If there wasn't the political will for it. I mean, so we're here with a political aim in mind. And I say that not on a partisan kind of way, but we're here because of problems with how people relate to one another, which is essence of politics, and who gets what, when, where, and why, that we have structural, regulatory, and legislative issues with how we order our lives together. Right. And we've set, we spent these months setting a policy agenda. So I think part of what we're talking about is an implementation strategy to get these policies moved and to build the will around them to get them moved. Right. So when you look at this multiple entity structure, your issue-specific action, you could have a partner whose specialization is policy. But this middle relationship manager person is probably not going to be that person. The middle relationship manager person is going to be someone who's neutral, that people feel comfortable, that they're not going to, go too far one way or the other, that they can invite people in as needed, that they can make the space inclusive. But that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have somebody in one of those circles who can really go in on a particular action or activity. That's one of the advantages for having the multiple entities, is because you can specialize. When you get to the single entity, it's much more difficult to do that. So here's an example of a collective impact initiative that uses multiple entities. So the way that this is structured, Memphis Fast Forward is the overarching collective impact initiative, and they've identified 5 sub-initiatives that are coordinated under Memphis Fast Forward. And each of these sub-initiatives also has its own backbone organization. So this is a much larger initiative than the Strive one that we looked at. There's more infrastructure, a lot more planning went into it, a lot more partners, but this is what multiple entity could look like. So now I'm going to talk about a process for selecting either one of these, either a single entity or a multiple entity. So as I mentioned, the single entity is the least labor intensive. So this is a simple, well, I shouldn't say simple. It's the least labor intensive way to get all of this done. It puts most of the responsibility on whoever the backbone might be to figure out a lot of the work on how to move things forward. So it would start off with that concept of identifying a unifying priority, so that you could say, if we wanted to look at economic development, who should be in this space? If we want to look at this as an education issue, who should be in this space? Possibly you could have more than one issue, but once you get beyond that, you're not going to find too many single entities who are really working in a focused way on those issues. So once you identify that priority, you would host a technical assistance meeting with the candidates based on that priority. So you would say, we really want to talk to organizations who are working in the space of economic development. This is our call to action plan. This is what we would like to see happen. Tell us how you would approach moving this plan forward. And those candidates would actually just submit a proposal addressing your key considerations. So they would talk about how their core activities already support the work, what they would need to add as far as capacity and leadership to address the full scope of the work. So again, if they're focused on one area and it doesn't hit the other two, how would they accommodate that? Which parts of the work they would not want to do directly, so that speaks to that piece about being neutral. The things that they know are limitations for them, they would have to disclose that up front. How they would secure ongoing resources, and then of course there will be other questions that we would want to determine to ask in this application process that perhaps the commission and staff would look at. When you go through your plan, aside from those 6 core functions of a backbone, are there other things that you're accustomed to that you would want to see carry forward? The staff would then narrow the list based on the proposals that are received and invite the top candidates to do presentations at a public meeting like this, and then the commission would select a top candidate. So it's a pretty straightforward process, like most calls for qualifications. It should be noted, though, even after the single entity is selected, it shouldn't appear as if the entity is selected and the Ferguson Commission vanished. There needs to be some communication of transition for how either key leaders or volunteers with the commission will stay engaged, either perhaps even staff or volunteers can stay engaged for the first phase or so. If it looks publicly like it was done and handed off, I think that might diminish the confidence that people might have in that group who takes on the work to move it forward. So that's just something to consider. So then this is the multiple entity selection process. In this process, you may be able to identify that neutral relationship manager without going through a long process, because that is going to be a finite universe of intermediary type organizations who are in a position to manage collectives. So again, you would establish your selection criteria and prioritize your key values, tasks, and outcomes for all of the partners that would be involved. And what I would suggest in this that is, I believe, closest to movement building is that you would actually host a series of sessions or meetings, and you would invite stakeholders to plan together how they would design a collective impact model. So the distinction would be that when you get to these key tasks about inviting partners, you would say, we're hosting a session on this particular signature priority around child welfare. All of the organizations who work in this space, we invite you to come, talk through these recommendations with us, talk with one another because you're all working in this space, and then design a collective impact approach to moving these recommendations forward. I think what this does is it gives everyone an opportunity to buy in and to see themselves as a part of moving the solution forward. And it also allows you to establish some of the relationships that may be necessary to actually design this collective impact approach going forward. So it's not one organization going off and coming back and saying, here's what we will do, but it's you putting a charge to a sector to say, we've identified these issues in your sector as a group. How do you think these issues should be addressed? It does require more work from the staff and perhaps even the commissioners to actually convene these meetings and to have these conversations. You may have to provide some technical assistance as people are thinking these issues through, but it creates a space that's more like a think tank where people are coming together to problem solve based on the actions. Instead of people asking you, what should we do with this? They're telling you, this is what we can do with this if you create that type of space. Once the sectors have discussed the calls to action that are relevant for them, then your request is that they design a collective impact team based on the relationships that are established through that process. And then you could have the same, present what your idea is and how you would do this, and you would still whittle it down to the top 3 and select. I believe at this point, if you were to have a panel to select, that you should also include members of the public. There is an opportunity for them to be involved throughout the process so that they understand collective impact, they understand the cost to action, and they get to see who's already supposed to be doing this work. I think a big part of collective impact is holding people accountable, because in every sector there's someone who says, I'm working on this issue. And I think if we elevate the work that they're doing and we give them some assistance by bringing together other people who may also be working in that space but for whatever reason haven't communicated, then it might strengthen their ability to move something forward together. And so then the final decision, of course, is made by the Ferguson Commission on who that intermediary is and what that collective will look like. I didn't include this as a slide, but GlaxoSmithKline just did a process similar to this, not to this scale at all, but where they asked organizations to actually form their collective and talk about how they would address an issue together as a part of their proposal process. So that is all I have, and I know we have 5 minutes, so, all right?
Thank you very much. Because this is kind of a process that we'll be going through together over the course of our time post-report, we wanted to have this kind of educational opportunity for commissioners, but then also, so in presentation, but also in response. So are there other questions as we kind of think about how we go forward in this that commissioners have of Ms. Muhammad? Commissioner Packnett.
So I think I heard you correctly, but I want to make sure that I did. When you were, I think, very helpfully talking about the necessity of movement principles being involved in what we're doing here, were you saying that the multiple entity selection process you think more allows for the implementation of movement
Yes.
principles? Okay.
I think you can do it in either, but it's usually simpler in the multiples process.
Thank you. I just wanted that clarified. Thanks.
That's it. Wow.
Other questions, responses?
So thank you for your thoughtfulness in this and your continued help to us through this process. You've been instrumental, and you've been involved in research and pulling concepts together, not just for us, but you've been working in this space for some time, and so that's immensely helpful to us. So we're very grateful, Serena, for your willingness to do that.
Thank you.
And help us as a volunteer. My question relates to examples, models. You've mentioned Strive in a couple of settings. You've mentioned Memphis Forward. You've mentioned something GlaxoSmithKline recently. Are the key principles from those models reflected here, or is there some learning from any of those that perhaps a deeper dive would help us with?
The key principles are reflected. I think the biggest distinction is, in most of these instances, because they start off relationship-based, it's usually a very clear choice whether or not you go with a single entity or a multiple entity. But because in this instance you're passing the torch, you have an opportunity to decide whether or not it makes the most sense to look at one unifying issue in that single entity structure, or to really build out this multiple entity structure that can engage as many members of the community into the problem solving as possible. So a part of it is, what is going to be your appetite for continuous heavy lifting over the next few months? Because as I said, the single entity is a simpler solution, but you may not get the same level of impact as you would get for the multiple entity, only because it doesn't immediately engage as many people. You're really putting it up on that single entity to figure out how to do the engagement, how to implement, and do all of it. Whereas with the multiple entity process, you're setting the space, you're convening around issues that are sector specific, and then you're telling those sectors to come back to you with an approach that weaves all of their specific strengths together. So, and that's really what collective impact is. It usually happens over a period of time based on relationships, but because this is a condensed process, you're kind of creating a pressure cooker where you can get those people together who might not already be talking to start forming those relationships and start doing some of the problem solving.
I have two quick questions. I'm sorry. The first question is, I have two mics, okay. The first question, funny. The first question that I have is, you gave us wisdom I don't want to lose in terms of, give us your advice on the handoff being appropriate. To what extent do we transition this baton without going too far? Because I'm in a nonprofit where we were to receive recommendations from another entity that when my board got it, they wanted to chomp on it their way and make it theirs. So what would be that appropriate handoff based on your experience? Is my first question.
So I think as much as you can be visibly involved as having some level of oversight, that will help. So if there's, for example, an opportunity to say that the Ferguson Commission will check in on the work of this collective annually, and we're going to be kind of an external, I don't like to use the word watchdog, but some external group that's making sure that these things actually happen, that raises the level of accountability for whoever decides to take it on, but it also shows the public that there is a continued interest and commitment from the people who were at the table. So I don't know if you can formally do that as the Ferguson Commission or what that would look like, but what I think would be detrimental to the process is if it looks like you handed it off and vanished, because then it's really up to this new entity to move it forward with the same passion that was put into it, and that doesn't always happen. Because in most collective impact initiatives, the planners are involved in the implementation in some way. It's very rare that somebody creates a plan and then they hand it to somebody else to do.
My final question is, GlaxoSmithKline, you talked about engaging a process not as robust as ours, but similar enough. Over what amount of time did it take them to do that?
So when GlaxoSmithKline first designed their process and they brought it to St. Louis, it actually didn't work, so they had to retool it. So when you look at all of the time together, it took about 2 years for them to figure out how to invite people to participate in a collective impact initiative.
Commissioner Pulliam, did you?
I have to say something, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be disruptive, but I think multiple entities has been the problem that we've all been having, but then at the same time, we all have a problem with giving one single entity all the opportunities, so where do we meet in the middle?
So I think the problem that we've been having is multiple entities that don't talk to one another. What should happen in collective impact is multiple entities who are coordinating with one another. So they're communicating so that they're not duplicating services. And I'm going to go back to this slide just so I can illustrate this point. So the essential functions of a backbone organization, there are 6. We're not necessarily asking each entity to do all 6. We're saying that there's somebody out there who's already advancing policy. We need to bring them into alignment with the folks who are looking at guiding a vision and strategy. So it's people playing the role that they're best positioned to play and not trying to do everything. And the fact that there are multiple entities mean that they now have to start talking to one another so that there's some coordination. But I agree that there is a problem when you have lots of people working in a space and they're not talking to one another.
I'm sorry, isn't this privatization by another name? At what point do the citizens, the majority of which are black of Ferguson, actually have a vote? Because you're talking about a lot of corporate entities, but no vote, nobody's been elected, and to me this sounds very patronizing, and it's not dealing with police criminality, prosecutorial overreach. I don't mean to attack you, but to me, this looks like privatization by another name.
So I'll say a couple of things, appreciating your comment. First, I don't think that, if you look at the examples, Memphis Fast Forward, which I'm familiar with, most of the entities that are engaged there, both in leadership and the initiative and anchoring them, are public. So we've not discussed particular entities. There have been some models that have been pointed out who can anchor the work. But most of those people are not also specific to any particular industry. I think the examples that we've heard were, if you're dealing with something in economics, then maybe the Economic Development Partnership is as specific as anyone got. So as we're talking about privatization, I think that's not where I'm going, right? So just note that what we're talking about is a process, and we're talking about publicly how we plan on engaging in a process to figure out how to embed long-term work that is regional, not city-specific, because our work has always been regional, to address the issues that have identified in our managing director's report in those 4 big chunks. Justice for all, so that's clearly primary still for us. Youth at the center around these long-term social issues, recognizing that it's generational, and opportunities to thrive. That's still the work. What we're talking about right now is a process by which we assure that someone is accountable to the public, and I think that word continues to come up, accountable to the public for this work when this body horizons by virtue of an executive order. So part of what we're dealing with, and I think, again, we believe that these issues are regional. To Jarek's point, quite frankly, they're national. Our charge has always been regional, and so we have been very intentional to work in Ferguson, to work in South City, quite frankly, where we saw these issues, to work to speak in St. Charles, because our respective fragmentation is part of how we got here. So at this point, we're in commission discussion, which I'm trying to be respectful. We're in commission discussion, but the reality is, and I think we'd be pleased to have conversation with you about our approach and ideology over time, but for the sake of everybody's time, particularly people like Bob, who've been to 11 meetings and he understands that we've been working regionally and advancing not just core conditions, but socially underlying conditions, because that's our work, then we should have that conversation offline. So any other questions from commissioners? Commissioner
Yes.
Miller.
Specifically, I wanted to ask when organizations, whether we decide on a single entity or multiple entities, when they come forward with ideas about how to move our work forward, do they also come forward with their ability to, with a plan for accountability? Because what I'm concerned about most is once our recommendations are out and once the community has the ability to absorb them and think about which ones they would like to prioritize, who is the accountable body for whatever gets moved forward?
Right. So I think that the entities that come forward can propose what accountability should look like, but I also believe that before you even make the request, you should have an idea of what you would like to see in place. So a part of this process in designing the application, when we're figuring out what questions we want to ask, that's where that type of discussion would take place. So we would say that these are the elements that we believe we need to see in order to ensure accountability, and then you would ask the applicant how they would address that.
Thank you.
Serena, I would just like your thoughts around the need for ongoing engagement by the Ferguson Commission. So what I'm hearing you say, what I believe that I understand from what you're saying, is that engagement is important not only for accountability, but it seems to me like further authorizing the work, further authority. So in your work here, in understanding of collective impact models, how unique it is that we would take our plan and pass it off. You're saying we need to stay here sort of as a monitoring, despite which pathway we take, single or multiple, anticipate that in terms of some management and authority. Is that what I'm hearing?
So what I'm suggesting is that either members of the commission take that responsibility, or that you actually design an accountable body. So you could decide that, I don't know, a majority would annually convene to review what is happening with whoever moves the work forward. But I think that there needs to be some intentional connection between the group who did the planning and whoever's going to implement. And you have to figure out what your comfort level is for doing that, because I understand that people signed up for a particular assignment in a particular period of time, and what I'm recommending may be beyond that. So I understand that it's a recommendation. So.
It sounded like. Okay, but that's,
yeah.
All right, I just wanted to be clear about that. So, and that recommendation is not dependent on our selection of a single or multiple entities, but in the design of the follow-through, the consideration is how this body stays engaged in some capacity to
Right.
move it
Or,
forward and monitor.
I mean, I know that you have a brilliant team that's been working with you this entire time. So they may figure out a communication strategy that mitigates that. The thing that's important is that people understand that the work wasn't just passed off, that there's still some investment and interest in from the original planners. So how you do that could look differently. What I'm proposing is that you can do that in the selection process and in the structure that's established, but there may be other ways to do that as well.
Got it. There may be one more comment from Commission. I'm sorry, I can't take more from the public. We're already 15 minutes over, and we have other business we got to do. So are there any Commissioner Gordon?
Could you, just real quick, just talk a little bit about what, is there anything in the research that you've looked at that talks about what goals are most achievable through collective action and what those goals look like? How defined are they? Just those sorts of issues.
So the wonderful thing about collective impact is that in theory, works with everything. It works with in any space. So when you look at examples of issues that have been addressed with collective impact, they range from seniors aging in place, to addressing a heroin epidemic, to childhood obesity. Collective impact is just a way of organizing. It's not necessarily issue specific. So when you think about those 5 conditions, what we're basically saying is for any group to get together and decide that they want to work together successfully, these are the things that they need to have: a common agenda. So it can be any common agenda. Shared measurement, a way to figure out that they're all looking at the same thing and they're tracking it in the same way. So again, you could be measuring anything as long as there's a shared measurement. Mutually reinforcing activities, that everyone is aligning and putting their best forward for the collective. So you're not outside of your lane, you're really focused in and you're able to specialize. That you have the backbone infrastructure so that there's some entity that has made the commitment to carry out those 6 core functions, and you have continuous communication. So the idea is that if these conditions are met, you can use collective impact to work on any issue. And there is no best issue or most suited issue.
I want to thank Ms. Muhammad for her guidance and her leadership. I'm going to invite this time commissioners to consider in your packet the October through December 15 transition budget, asking our managing director to come forward now, giving us some guidance. We invite you, if you really want to be prepared, to also get handy your August 7th minutes so that we have those ready to act upon following the work on the budget.
Thank you. Action item 1, directing your attention to the transition to implementation budget. It is forecasted that the Ferguson Commission will have $519,000 remaining from the $1.267 million in revenue to use for implementation planning activities for this period. So as we've discussed today, the work of collective impact, this is a projection as to how we need to work together in terms of the existing funding we have from October 1st through December 31st, 2015. This forecasted amount consists of both private and public funds. Private funds are approximately $63,800, and obligated public grants are in the amount of $455,000. And we are working to ensure with the public grant funds that all of our activity is connected to what is eligible to be expended as well under the guidelines. I want to take you through projected expenses. It's really pretty simple. Under independent contractors, I'm projecting retaining the managing director through December 31st, the media and community relations function, and one of the strategic planning services contracts, in addition to Truman, who has supported us with their evaluation work with 3 deliverables left to provide. That total dollar amount is a little over $157,000 in that line item. The second expense line is professional fees. And with professional fees, that specific piece is dedicated to resource the support of dissemination. So as we talked about, the platform that is the final report, this would allow us to continue with that resource to be up and to allow for additional education and awareness of that platform. The projected amount needed for that is $50,000 plus dollars. Office operations, we budgeted $4,000, which is for the telephone, copy, supplies, and some food that supports our meetings. And then as we've discussed today, the backbone planning function, we have added a line item different than what we've done in the past for $100,000 to support the infrastructure for sustainability of our work. Under commission report and dissemination, that's all the way on the right-hand side of your document. Phase 2, this is what we're calling phase 2 of the report platform. So what keeps community engaged between report release and the infrastructure that we set up is making sure that we have a robust platform that allows for momentum and capturing public feedback on the calls to action as we put the infrastructure in place. This would give us functionality to help increase civic engagement within the report so that it's not just one way. And then finally, you'll see here, community engagement and commission meetings is a placeholder number of $156,726. This I put in as a placeholder. We have 5 public confirmed meetings, October through December, with which we would use that time to discuss as we are today the backbone structure. Should it be that we provide space in kind, if we get other in-kind donations, that dollar amount can be smaller than what you see. But overall, this is the budget that I'm projecting to ask for approval with your discussion tonight.
I have a question about when will we select the approach to the backbone? And we have 100,000. Is it what's the process, and when will we decide?
That's a great question. I think, in essence, we've begun the process tonight of the shift to think about the design of that structure. I think to stay to our commitment of making sure that we have as much in place as we can before our sunset, we'll need to be aggressive in the September-October timeframe. But we have through December 31st to make all those decisions.
So selecting a particular model is down the pike.
The model and the entity or entities, as we've discussed tonight,
Sure.
is down the pike. Yes, sir. Good question.
Other questions or comments?
Okay.
So one thing that we note, and I know this is work the staff is doing, is the identification of the various revenue sources, streams,
Correct.
and the numbers related to them. I see this is October through December. Do we have a sense that before or between now and the September 9 meeting that we'll be able to identify more clearly how much is the grants and how much is the private funds?
We've been working over the past week or so to refine that, and we need about another week to make sure that those numbers are down to the cent on each of these. So yes, by the 9th meeting, we should be able to clarify that.
If there's no objection, for the sake of this being balanced with both revenues and expenditures, that perhaps we can take this as information and under consideration.
I'm comfortable.
So as staff does that additional work, and what we get a chance to see in the September 9th meeting is both sides of the ledger here, then we take action at that point.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful as well with United Way there's a transition there. We have leadership in place, and so that would give us some time to be able to right-size that number.
Got it. Any other questions or comments related to this?
Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank you very much for
I'll
that.
take that feedback back, and I appreciate the commissioners weighing in on that. Second in your packet is the minutes from our last meeting on August the 7th. Requesting approval of the minutes for public posting.
Moved and properly seconded that the August 7th meeting minutes be approved for posting. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please notify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Any abstentions? Motion carries.
Great. With that, the final part of the managing director report is actually to provide an update to commissioners on our final report and its process and the status. So at this time, I'll ask Nicole Hudson to come to provide you with that report.
So we have a couple extra calls, which fit nicely into our previously established buckets, so will not hold up our progress on getting out drafts of the report, which staff are reviewing some of, actually, I believe, as we meet tonight. Commissioners should be getting your first round of documents to review probably tomorrow. Those will come again digitally with directions on how to go in and comment. And thank you for those who have come forward and volunteered to be readers. We are still looking at the end of this week to have everything pushed out, at least in the first phase of draft. So it may not make it to commissioners until early the following week, but we are still looking at the end of this week to have a first draft, at least, of everything pushed out. Again, those will not be linear. Those will be coming as we're working on them. We're starting at the bottom, at the C-SPAN layer with all the background documents, so that's the stuff that you'll be getting first. Yeah, we've got the CNN layer and the PBS layer and the C-SPAN layer. So we are on schedule to have the digital platform probably ready to start poking around beginning of next week. And we'll be identifying a time when we can share a password for you guys to start to review what that looks like. And we're looking at having the report finalized by the 10th. So everything is moving along on schedule. Any questions? Happy reading. So when the first round goes out, it'll go to all the commissioners. So we have a handful, I think 6, a little more than a handful, that have said they will read everything, and then everyone will get the notice, and there'll be a deadline on it. So whoever wants to get in and jump in is welcome to. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. Nicole and the entire staff team have been laser focused on this for some time, as you might expect, and the support team at Truman and many other places are there. So a lot of work to be done, but they are moving apace and on schedule, and we appreciate the help of the commission. So our next meeting is Wednesday, September 9th, which will be at the Ferguson Community Center, where our first meeting occurred, and we look forward to seeing everyone there. We're going to close now. Thank you for your patience. We are beyond time. We're going to stand as we have in the past and observe a tradition which has become ours for those that are here for the first meeting. We have been closing our meeting just in moments of silence, asking folks to just pause and reflect in silence in your own way on the circumstances in our region, on the events of the past week, with thoughts and prayers for safety and for comfort and for peace. And we would ask that each of us do that in our own way, and we will pause here and then we'll be adjourned. Thank you very much.